Good morning and welcome to the virtual panel discussion on stigma and racism in times of epidemics. Thank you for attending and being in this space. Before we get started, we'd like to share a few things. First, this panel is hosted virtually. Please be patient and flexible with potential tech challenges that may arise. If you have technological questions, please feel free to direct them to the Q&A feature on this webinar, and we'll do our best to assist. Dean Melissa Begg from the Columbia School of Social Work will start things off and introduce our amazing panelists. The panelists will then answer some of the questions that you all submitted ahead of time, and then attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions live through the Q&A feature on this webinar. Please note that this panel will end promptly at noon. I would now like to introduce the host for today's session, Dr. Melissa Begg, who became the 18th Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work on September 1st, 2019. A longtime faculty member, she is a population health scientist with a strong record of accomplishment in research, education, and mentorship, fostering interdisciplinary collaboration, and promoting diversity in academia. Dr. Begg is proud to join the Columbia social work community in its vigorous pursuit of social justice and equity.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to everyone in our audience for joining us today. I'm looking forward to an in-depth discussion of the ways in which stigma and racism arise in times of epidemics. With COVID-19, we've seen an increase in acts of racism and even outright violence against Asian-identified members of our communities in New York and across the country. This is intolerable. Today's panel is one element of our response to this troubling issue, enabling us to learn from experts who studied these issues in the past. We'll have an opportunity to interrogate root causes, discuss ways to reduce threats, and express our unmitigated support for our colleagues who have suffered in this way. In addition, just this past week, there's been new data that reveals startling differences in COVID death rates by race, with African American and Latinx members of our communities experiencing a far worse course of disease. There's also a suggestion of similar disparities in our Indigenous communities. Today, let's delve into a clear-eyed analysis of these patterns so that we can identify the right tools and strategies to address them head on. At this point, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce the esteemed members of our panel. Moderating today's session is Dr. Robert Fullilove. Dr. Fullilove is Professor of Socio-Medical Sciences and Associate Dean for Community and Minority Affairs at the Mailman School of Public Health here at Columbia. He has devoted much of his career to issues concerning the health of marginalized groups. He served on leadership panels for the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, and the National Academy of Sciences, addressing topics such as AIDS, tuberculosis, and substance abuse and addiction. He's also been an instructor in the Bard Prison Initiative since 2010. Let me add that Dr. Fullilove and I arrived at Columbia at about the same time, more than 30 years ago, and I have had the honor of working with him on various projects over that period. Next, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Merlin Chowquanyan. He is the Donald H. Gempson Assistant Professor of Socio-Medical Sciences at the Mailman School as well. His work centers on the history of community health, environmental health regulation, racial inequalities, and social movements and activism around health. With funding from the National Science Foundation, he is analyzing previously secret documents on toxic industrial poisons. He's also writing a book examining localism and health politics in the wake of World War II. Dr. Chowquanyan is a member of the Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health, as well as the Data Science Institute. Next, Dr. Alyssa Davis is Assistant Professor at the Columbia School of Social Work. As an epidemiologist, her research focuses on improving access to healthcare for marginalized populations, thereby reducing risk of HIV, sexually transmitted infections, tuberculosis, and substance use disorders. She has worked in the US, as well as in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and China. Dr. Davis has received funding for her work from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Institute of Mental Health, the Fogarty International Center, and the Mellon Foundation. Karma Lowe is the School of Social Work's inaugural Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, leading a new office formally established last year. During her tenure in various student-facing roles for the school, she has been a beloved advisor to numerous student advocates who share her passion for extending diversity and inclusion practices across the school. Under Dean Lowe's leadership, the office provides a wide range of programming and community building efforts for students experiencing marginalization. I'm so happy to welcome the entire panel. Thank you for joining us. At this point, it's my pleasure to turn to you, Bob, and get us underway.
Good morning, everyone. If the counter on my screen is correct, it appears as if we have almost 800 folk participating in this meeting. Really glad to welcome you all here. I can't imagine a more important discussion for us to be having at this point in our nation's struggles with COVID-19. And I want to begin our deliberations this morning by asking our panel members if they'd say something about the work that they're doing at present, which is specifically targeted towards our response to COVID-19. I'm especially interested in the kind of work that people are doing that challenges the issues that we're raising with this seminar. What are we going to do about racism and the way in which it's playing itself out in horrible fashion with respect to this particular epidemic? So Dr. Chakwanian, if I could begin with you, might you say something about what you're doing at this point in our struggles? I think we have an issue with the mute. Okay.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me now? Great. Yeah. There's no direct change to my research at present because I'm a historian. And so the things I tend to be interested in are, 150, 200, 20 years previous from now. But the one thing that I am trying to do a lot that COVID has really been extraordinarily generative in my thinking for is inspired by this quotation by the late historian Eric Hobsbawm. He wrote something like this, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, the job of the historian is to remember everything that society would rather forget. And so in recent American history, this has made me think a lot about singular events, episodes not unlike this one that seem to throw society into temporary chaos, whether it's an epidemic or a quote unquote natural disaster or whatever. But it's made me think a lot about those kinds of events where we've declared victory, but at the same time left people behind in declaring victory, or we've had no actual victory and we've just left people behind. And so some examples I've thought a lot about that you could kind of put in a chain, and then you can ask where COVID fits in the chain, are as follows. One is HIV/AIDS. So a lot of people nowadays in popular discussion describe HIV/AIDS as a manageable chronic disease, right? You'll hear things like no longer a death sentence, et cetera, but we know that there are a lot of people who are left out of that celebratory narrative based on the racial disparity statistics that we see about HIV/AIDS and who continues to get it and who continues to die from it in excess numbers. And then in the recent American past, just in my adult life, this has very much been an age of chaos, but then forgetting. So, I was just kind of taking some notes today and thinking about these kinds of events, but Hurricane Maria, which happened not too long ago, Hurricane Katrina, the BP oil spill in the Gulf, the Flint lead disaster, all of these had a real fallout for racialized minorities. And all of them, I think, have kind of strangely receded in the larger public memory. They weren't that long ago, some of these events, and at the time they seemed like utter outrages. But there's something in the collective memory that seems to at once become that tends to glom on to singular events and then kind of forgets them, or especially when we get to this victory declaring phase, or if there is no victory because the overwhelming proportion of the people affected are racialized minorities, it's simply forgotten after a time. And so the data from COVID, especially this disturbing data that Dean Begg referred to earlier about some of these stark SES and racial disparities that appear to be surfacing now, makes COVID look like less a discrete episode than a manifestation of long-standing social forces in the United States, especially social forces where marginalized populations with low resources perpetually get the short end of the stick. And so I've been trying to think a lot about how COVID fits into what you might call this age of episodic thinking and age of forgetting. So that's what I've been thinking about a lot in the past month or so. I'm wondering if I'm supposed to be saying, oh, there we go.
No, I'm trying to unmute myself.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my mistake too.
We're a collection of academics, which also means that many of us are control freaks. Zoom is one of those platforms where controlling your image as well as your voice becomes absolutely paramount. And when you can't unmute and your mouth is moving, oh my. Dr. Davis, might I ask you to say something about your own work in this area? And some of the problems with muting and unmuting.
Thanks, Bob. Like Merlin mentioned a bit about people living with HIV, that's a population that we are really concerned about right now because they're immunocompromised, and as Merlin mentioned, they tend people who are from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds tend to be disproportionately affected in terms of access to care. So previously, prior to COVID-19, there were greater challenges in accessing treatment, accessing testing, and accessing the care that they needed. And now those problems are compounded more during the COVID-19 epidemic, and it makes things more challenging. Another population that we're particularly concerned about and that we're starting a study on now is looking at adolescents from different racial and ethnic minority backgrounds and the mental health impacts of COVID-19 on these adolescents. So, for example, how is anti-Asian racism and discrimination during COVID-19 affecting these adolescents' mental health? How are they coping with it? Also, adolescents from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds are much more likely to know someone who is infected. They're much more likely to know someone who's died of COVID-19. They're much more likely to be economically impacted by COVID-19. And how are all of these factors impacting their mental health? Because we anticipate that this is going to cause long-term effects. And so these immediate forms of stigma and discrimination that we're seeing are going to play out longer term, and we're going to see continued impacts from this. So we are really interested in learning more about how these issues are impacting adolescents' mental health, what they need, and how we can best create an intervention to address some of the serious mental health issues that we anticipate many adolescents will have as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that a one-size-fits-all approach won't work for everyone, and traditionally interventions have been targeted and developed for primarily white populations. And so we're trying to be very thoughtful about the interventions we're creating to make sure it addresses the needs of the populations most affected by this epidemic.
Excellent. Dr. Lowe, it's on you.
Thanks, Bob. Not a doctor yet.
Oh.
No, it's okay. I appreciate it. For me and my work with DEI and focusing on students primarily, but also our faculty and staff, I find myself really focusing more on the inclusion piece. I think as the pandemic was really starting to rise, a few months ago, we were seeing a lot of anti-Asian racism or racism against Asian presenting folks. And that was really our primary focus around both our messaging and raising awareness and really wanting people to name it as being anti-Asian racism and not just xenophobia or discrimination. And then, as more reports are coming out around the disparities, health disparities in African-American and Latinx communities, and now with the more recent calls for the mandatory use of face coverings and masks, we're seeing a now increased rise of racist acts against Black Americans, particularly Black males. And so being between that and then almost a lack of reporting on what's happening in our Indigenous American communities, which I look at erasure by omission, right? And so for me, it's really focusing on how do we, to build on what Merlin was saying, how do we continue to not forget and not remain silent? And how do we hold all these spaces so that we are, supporting and honoring what's happening in all of these communities, and Asian communities and Black, Latinx, Native American communities, and also how are we supporting and wrestling with what's happening, with the anti-African sentiment in certain parts of China, and how, we have, students who are trying to, stand in solidarity with their Asian colleagues. And at the same time, we're sort of feeling like, well, then how do I reconcile these feelings of anger and frustration of what I'm watching happening to my family or friends, in different parts of the world? And so for me, I really feel like it highlights this need for us to be more inclusive, to be more self-aware, to really focus on coalition building, and really to remember that this is not a disease that's targeting any one community. We really need to sort of look at the multi-pronged approach and addressing how all of these various communities are being impacted, and the long-term impacts. Like Alyssa says, we're really concerned about, our students' emotional and mental health, our colleagues' emotional and mental health, as they're wrestling with what the impact of this pandemic on their own personal lives, the constant barrage of the news stories. And so that's sort of how I look at it with the impact on our work, is really maintaining a continued conversation around racism across the various constituencies.
Very good. Let me just say that my own work has been largely focused on what's happening to prison populations in the United States. I imagine that all of the folk who are part of this seminar have been reading accounts, as have I, of growing rates of infection amongst incarcerated persons, amongst staff. And it becomes really clear that many of us who work with these populations are really literally scared to death that at any moment we're going to have a major outbreak in a prison facility. And the most important thing won't simply be the high rate of morbidity and mortality. There's going to be a sense that this was preventable mortality. This is a tragedy that could have been averted. It's not as if people haven't been warned that this was likely to occur. And the fact that it did not will engage many of us in a lot of hand-wringing and worrying about missed opportunities. And it seems to me that one of the most important things those of us who do this kind of work are about is making sure that we have our voices heard in any setting and in any place where we have to call attention to all the things that the panel participants have raised attention to in the course of their comments. At that level, because I'm also working with the community of folk here in Washington Heights, I live on 169th Street, 2 blocks away from my office at the medical center. One is very concerned about, for example, many of the issues that plague a community like this, where, for those of you who've read the New York Times this morning, one of the most interesting risk factors associated with mortality from COVID-19 is obesity. Many of us work in communities where of all the chronic disease conditions that we worry about most, obesity has to be number one. And it's increasingly being flagged by physicians and healthcare providers saying that someone who comes in massively overweight is a challenge at just about every level of care that we're in a position to offer. So it's also taken many of us back to our roots in public health, where messages of prevention, especially about chronic disease, especially preventable chronic disease, is something that I've been trying with colleagues to continue to sort of privilege, if you will, in our communications, because in addition to being concerned about what's happening now, we're all concerned about what will happen in the future. And one hopes that one of the occurrences as a result of COVID-19 will be an increasing awareness in the communities that are targeted about the importance of public health interventions that are dealing with obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And it won't just be programs and interventions. There will also be a sense of agency where folks feel that their own behavior can be an important way in which they themselves confront the problems that are created by a pandemic like this, and where issues of prevention might have a great deal to do with what will happen in the future when the next pandemic comes our way. And then finally, one of the things that we have all been talking about, since we're speaking to an audience of folk who are concerned with social services and who are, I'm sure many of them, social workers, this might be the moment to ask the question, in the face of everything that's happened, especially incidents of bias, xenophobia, and racism, what might a social worker, someone who's engaged in the provision of these services, what might they do at this moment in the pandemic to help us lessen the impact that it's having on so many of the communities we've been describing? Might I ask Dr. Davis, since this is an area of concern that you mentioned with mental health, really interested in what advice you'd give to the social workers present in the audience who are interested in doing something concrete to battle against some of the issues that you raised so eloquently.
Yeah, so I think it's very challenging to make structural changes as an individual that really would be the most beneficial for everyone. But we know from research studies that social support can play a major protective role in trying to mitigate some of the damage from people experience from racism and discrimination. And so I think as social workers and clinicians, this can also be challenging if populations don't have access to web services or phones or computers right now. Being a source of social support and someone that they can contact can be really helpful for them, because then at least they have someone who cares about them and they feel like there is some social support coming their way. So I have friends who are social workers working in the field in a number of different states. And so they, where possible, will go pick up medications for patients, for example, or help connect them to services that they're not able to connect to on their own. And sometimes just having a call with patients to talk about their concerns and their worries can be really helpful.
I think that's really important, because one of the things that I've noted is there are a flood of telephone calls and email inquiries to all kinds of social service agencies. Everybody's confused about, what am I eligible for? What am I going to get? I just lost my job. What can I do? That maze of information is difficult to navigate. And those of us who have some experience navigating those mazes still have work to do, whether it's in an agency that you work with, or maybe it's just because you have an understanding of the system. It seems to me that providing that kind of support becomes critical. Dean Lowe, how about yourself? Because you're concerned with the community as well as the students who are in the school. What would be your piece of advice that you might give at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think, social workers are the largest providers of mental health services in the United States. And so I think it's, first of all, really important to remember that. And as clinicians, just being very self-aware and mindful of sort of how we're interacting with the folks that are coming to social workers for assistance, validating, how folks are feeling. I mean, it's real, their anxieties, their fears, to stay away from the victim blaming as well. And so, it's often not that someone doesn't want to access certain healthcare, it's just that they don't have the access to it because it doesn't exist in their communities. Or, as we know, disproportionately, Black and Latinx community members are the frontline workers, particularly in the service industry. And so when we talk about risk factors and protecting our communities and our families, folks can't just do that, right? They have to work in order to pay their rent and pay their bills. I think it's also important to remember, both for social workers from a professional identity perspective, but just a larger public, that social workers are everywhere. They are policymakers. They are the ones who are at the seat of the table to influence those policies, to look at informing sort of where funding is being directed, whether it's on the local level or the national or federal level. And so I think it's also important for the social workers to remind themselves that, you can still be an advocate. You are a community organizer. Use your voice in the various ways that you can with respect to your power and positionality, and always being mindful to ensure that, the voice of these impacted communities is a part of that dialogue and that conversation, that as you're influencing or developing policy, that you're reminding people of the human face and the human impact, and that you are sort of raising that level of self-awareness and constantly keeping that in the forefront of these conversations.
Very good. Professor Chakwanian, I'm like you, somebody who's really fascinated by history. And there's an element of, haven't we been here before? That is, I think, a part of the reflections of many of us as we're trying to make sense of what's going on here. Three of us have real history working with HIV, for example. And there are some important lessons learned at the moment when we suddenly knew that HIV was the factor that was causing AIDS. We started to do the research that identified the patterns of health disparities and of the patterns in which the social drivers of health were really creating so much of what we were seeing with the HIV epidemic. I'm wondering whether, interestingly enough, the spate of xenophobia and racist reactions to this pandemic have lessons that we can take from the future that might be applied right now in the present. I know that this is a large part of your work. What's the advice that you would give to those of us we're trying to make sense of the present by looking at what happened in the past. What might you say to us?
Yeah, well, there's many things with a lot of the historical invocations that we've seen in the press are about epidemic control in a broad sense. But I actually think the most valuable lessons are about what we've been discussing, which is stigma, xenophobia, and racism. And I think it's very useful to think about prior episodes, epidemics, outbreaks, pandemics, where a rhetoric of blame emerged, and to try to show people that that is not a past that we want to repeat. And I have a real fear, not just with the China narrative, but also with the disparities statistics that kind of rhetoric of blame is going to reemerge here. But the good news is that we have historical evidence that shows this happened before, and therefore we have an alternative path that we can take. But certainly, towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when you had diseases like polio and trachoma and TB in particular, you get these two strands of thinking that actually are remarkably durable, even throughout the supposedly more enlightened late 20th century, early 21st century period. But I think if we highlight them distinctly, we can actually try to see hints that these are emerging and therefore try to stamp it out kind of preemptively. So the two strands are, one, that there's something inherently different, biologically different about outsiders that makes them more prone to get a disease or to spread it. Sometimes that's explicitly stated, sometimes it's more implied. But this is actually a very strong current, I think, this idea that there's a biological notion, a biological definition of race, and that it's linked to all sorts of race-specific diseases. That's number one. And the second that I think is more common is about behaviors and habits. It's this notion that there are all these awful things that outsiders and racialized minorities do, whether it's not following hygienic advice, whether it's strange eating practices, whatever. These are usually kind of very exoticized, awful stereotypical images, but this is common too. One of my big fears about the new data that we have on disparities is that people will simply present the disparities data without any context. And that opens up a lot of space for people to revive and reactivate these two strands that I've noted. Now, the good news is I've actually seen a lot of reporting in the press and by others discussing these disparity statistics that do an excellent job of actually contextualizing why this might be, how they are linked, for example, to the high number of minorities who work in low wage service work and are therefore exposed to COVID-19, to the virus much more so than perhaps others. So that's the good news. But the bad news is I've already seen from certain outlets attempts to explain these racial disparities by deference to kind of stereotypes about how people behave. I mean, we know that obesity, a lot of the obesity discourse can be very individualistically centered and can very much focus on simply the habits and eating habits of people, and not on the larger structural influences of obesity. And there was already a piece by, I kind of am ashamed to even give any airtime to this, but there's somebody named Heather McDonald who works at a think tank called the Manhattan Institute. So this is a right-wing think tank that defends police brutality and all sorts of other terrible things. But they have already put out a kind of a blog post saying, these are the things we don't want to talk about with when we look at racial disparities in COVID, and then kind of reviving these two tropes. So I think when we see these kind of two tropes, we need to confront them head on. But the good news is we know what they are. So it's not a surprise that this stuff keeps resurfacing, and therefore in some ways it's easier for us to kind of identify them and squash out what's wrong with them quite quickly.
That's very, very helpful. And I think one of the issues that arises from that narrative about history has a great deal to do with the mistrust that exists in many minority and immigrant communities about everything having to do with medicine, and certainly about advice that comes from government. A number of stories at the very beginning of the epidemic pointed out that in some African-American communities, folks say, wait, I don't believe a thing that I hear from a doctor. I'm not sure that the government has my best interests at heart. Okay, social separation, really? I'm not sure that that's really for me. And I think that's one of the problems, that messages that we try to pass in public health and from social service agencies, it often runs into the barrier that's created by that history and by the mistrust that that history generated. Tuskegee is in the mind of large numbers of African Americans. So hearing something from a doctor or from the government always has to pass through that filter. What I'd like for us to think about now is what happens when we finally have enough resources to do appropriate testing and contact tracing. That's going to let us know, as all of us know, how many people are at risk, how many people have been exposed, how many people have developed antibodies. But in order to go into communities and do that kind of testing and contact tracing, people in the community have to trust that the person who's doing all this, who's engaging in this, and who might make recommendations about social isolation is somebody who's a credible messenger, somebody that they can believe in. I'm interested in all this. What are the notions that we might help to develop that would reduce the levels of suspicion, would increase the likelihood that when we do attempt to collect the data that's going to be so necessary to get on top of this pandemic, that when those messages are ready and when the programs are put into place, that people will be there to openly accept what is something that we really understand is absolutely needed. Any notions about how we in social work or public health or together might figure out how to make those messages available to communities so that the work that needs to get done will get done? I'd ask almost anybody to take a shot at that. Ooh, please.
I mean, I do wonder if we will ever have enough resources to do contact tracing. I hope that that will be the case, but I think contact tracing is a very, very difficult thing to do. But I think there's no way we can do it among diverse populations, particularly in a place as diverse as New York City, without collaborating with communities. And community organizations and people who know the culture, who understand the mistrust, and where some of these historical traumas are coming from and how to address them. Because like, if I were to go into many of these communities, of course, people aren't going to trust me, and with good reason. History has shown that there's a lot of reason to mistrust government, to mistrust public health organizations. And so I think without collaborating with community organizations and community groups and having community health workers go in and serve as a bridge with these communities, I just don't think we'll be successful.
Anyone else? Any notions about ways in which this can occur? One of the enterprises that I've been engaged in, the Bard Prison Initiative, has been in operation since 1999. There are 21 years of folk who've taken college courses who are now back in the communities, and many of them are doing work in social service agencies. Many of them are connected to work done with HIV/AIDS and with addiction, since so many folks struggled with addiction during the period of time before they were incarcerated. And a whole number of folks are really sort of interested in ways in which public health work can impact things like, for example, our fights against violence, which is a real issue in so much of what we do in public health and in social service programs. We've been saying that folk who have returned from prison, who've had some exposure to public health courses, who've had some exposure to anything that helps them understand the nature of life in communities, that these are the folk who might be the credible messengers that we're talking about. So mobilizing that group of individuals to essentially come to a position where eventually they might fill these roles is one of the ways in which I'm sort of trying to connect the work that I've done in the past with the folk that I taught on the inside and the work that they're currently doing in communities. That's something that I'm hoping that Columbia University will back, and because I think this institution has taken the leadership in so many of the issues that have dealt with mass incarceration and the degree to which mass incarceration impacts the communities that are hard hit by this virus. I'm wondering, Dean Begg, is it okay to ask you something about what you think the School of Public Health excuse me, I'm giving you your old address, whether or not the School of Social Work might be in a position to do as an institution to sort of help us and guide us through what is going to be a period where leadership is going to be critically necessary?
Yeah, thank you,
That
Bob.
much of a question? I hope not.
Yeah, no, I think I want to echo what Alyssa said to start with, and what you've just said. It starts with working with communities directly, I believe, and the School of Social Work has partnerships with, on the low end, 500 to 600 community agencies across New York City and the tri-state area. That's a pretty good foundation from which to build on trust and to get our message out there. I think, we go way back, right? So you know that I'm a pretty passionate believer in the power of interdisciplinary approaches for addressing complex problems like this, right? And both public health, where you sit now, and social work, where I sit, we're built on a core of social justice, right? This is what we do. I think what we're watching right now, if I could just segue a little bit into what we're seeing, and I think what it demands of us, building on the community partnerships, but just I think we need all sorts of things. We need the education, we need the research, and we need the outreach. All of those in combination have to be there if we're going to be effective in making a difference here, in my view. Experts from both schools and across the university are watching now what's happened as a result, not just of the infection, but of the steps we had to take to mitigate its spread, and the serious social and economic damage that we're actually wreaking on ourselves due to necessary steps that, because we got so far along in this outbreak that we had to take. And I think the pandemic has laid bare 3 very serious problems that we need to confront, and hopefully together, right? The first is the lack of access to universal health care. The second is the wholly insufficient public health infrastructure for dealing with situations like this. And the third, that affects all areas of life, is the absence of an effective social safety net. And those 3 things together are really compounding the problem, making the predicament far worse than it ordinarily would be. And I will add that I think clinical social workers on the ground are seeing the impact of those deficits each and every day, right? They're dealing with the individuals and the agencies who confront those issues. They know too that once the contagion subsides, those social and economic impacts are going to continue long into the future. So the need for our attention on this is not going to go away. I think our shared expertise is really important for pursuing those questions going forward, as well as this issue of racism and stigma. I think there was a great quote by Jamel Bowie in the New York Times the other day. I don't know if you saw it, but he said, today's disparities of health flow directly from yesterday's disparities of wealth and opportunity. That's what we're looking at. So we need to right the wrongs, not just to contain the disease and its spread, but because we pursue justice. We have to do it in that sake too. So I think there's tremendous power in coming together across disciplines in order to address these issues together.
Very good.
Can I add something to
Yes,
that really quickly? Yeah, I mean, I think it's also just, it's not just crisscrossing across disciplines too in the academic space, but, I think a lot of times we forget that social work or public health that we tend to think of as these discrete slices, in fact, flow out to not just other sectors in the academy, but just society at large, across fields, across sectors. I mean, one of the things that's striking about COVID is just how many domains it touches. This crisis is just really affecting, for example, low-income tenants. I mean, there's a housing crisis that is even worse than the housing crisis that already existed, and people in low-wage service work. I read something shocking the other day, but the union Unite Here, which is a service workers union that has a particularly pronounced presence out west in the hotel and casino industry, expects that 90% of its workers will be laid off. So that's a 300,000 member union, 90% laid off. So, I mean, this is the time, as Dean Begg says, to think big and to think about how fields that we normally think of as kind of little enclaves really stretch out to in the broadest sense.
Very good. I started to say that one of the things that I've been doing has to do with my teaching. I teach 3 courses in 2 Columbia institutions, Teachers College, as well as the Mailman School of Public Health. In each of the classes, I've asked students to think about final projects that include writing to op-ed columns, to commentaries that are often welcomed by magazines and by, of course, the scientific journals where we try to publish, because I think we have to get on top of the narrative about what's going on with this pandemic. Part of the narrative that I worry about most was, for example, it's just the flu, they would have died anyway. And I think we're increasingly going to see a let's blame the victim. If you got COVID-19 because you were obese, you should have been on a diet. If you got COVID-19 because you're diabetic, you should have followed your doctor's advice. So this narrative that's basically going to say nobody's at fault other than the victim, and the narratives that have basically inflamed some of the racist, xenophobic sentiments that really are on occasion for this seminar. Those are the things that I think students and faculty, of course, are in a position to write about. We're experts. We do the work on the ground that gives us a voice that is privileged. And using that voice to try and counter this narrative, it seems to me, is really critically important. Those of you who are engaged in students, and I think that's all of us, is there any advice you're giving your students about what they might do that should be a part of the discussion we're having with this seminar? Any notions?
It's just exactly what you said, Bob. I mean, I know on the administrative level at social work, we're talking about using their coursework. Like our social work students are required to take a class in advocacy. It's like, how do we use their final projects to really focus on amplifying the voices of those who are coming from racialized minority groups that tend to be left out of the conversation, you know, and how do we, again, sort of just keep that level of self-awareness and really respect and understand that even the community members know best what the community needs, right? So it doesn't require, you know, a certain level of education. It doesn't require us as the so-called experts to come in, but how do you engage the community, as Alyssa and Dean Begg were saying, and to really tap into our informal networks. And so as social work students are going out as practitioners, it's really honoring and respecting that there are community members who've been doing this kind of work, who know the community, who are better positioned to be able to say how to communicate with those community members to help address some of these disparities. And also just reminding students that, you know, it's not just about to really look at this issue from the macro, the meso, and the micro level. So, you know, in addition to being on the ground and in the communities, also looking at the macro level of, you know, how are you influencing where these resources are going? You know, we talked about earlier about if we had the contact tracing and the resources to do testing. I mean, the studies are already showing that there are disparities in who has access to testing, right? If you look at the ability for lower SES communities to even get tested, we're on the bottom, you know, level. So how do we, as policymakers from a social work lens, really raise that, amplify that, and say, you know, as funding is coming in on a state or local level, how do we ensure that that funding and those resources are being diverted to the communities who really need it the most right now? And then how do we bridge the gap to connecting those same communities to adequate health care?
Very good. Anyone else who is engaged with students? Anything that needs to be added so that folks have a sense of how they can combine the graduate work that they're doing now at present with what will obviously be some of the things that they'll do at the point of graduation? Anything? Merlin, I think especially because a lot of your work has provided students as well as researchers with access to a variety of databases where all kinds of things about many of the drivers of public health can be found. Any notion as a historian about things that students should be saying, doing, and thinking that should be privileged in a seminar like this?
I mean, one thing, and it's a kind of dicey bit of advice that, you know, I have some misgivings about giving, but, you know, we live in a credential society, whether we like it or not, for better or for worse. I say usually for worse, but this is an example where it could be for better potentially, because if you have a lot of alphabets behind your name, people for some reason tend to listen to you more. And our students will have, or already do have, alphabets behind their names. And this is a chance to use those alphabets for good and not for, the usual hubristic, arrogant reasons that alphabets are usually channeled towards. One is to help people, as all of the panelists have said, counter destructive, toxic narratives that are in the air and circulating right now. I mean, one example that I'll give from last night is one of our colleagues uptown, Angela Rasmussen. So last night, she was using her social media platform, and she saw an article in the Washington Post about how this virus had supposedly originated in a lab in Wuhan. And she very point blank told, this was a legitimate reporter, by the way, reporting this. I think it came from a State Department cable or something like that. But she said, you could have called one of us, people who spend all our time tracing the origins of viruses and where they come from, because no scientist has actually given any credence to this Wuhan lab theory. And so I think, this is an example of somebody who has an expert base of knowledge that, is deeper than most people's, using that expert knowledge for good. Credibility, legitimacy matter. Again, sometimes there's an ugly side to that where lay people are shut out of the conversation. That's why I said this kind of dicey advice. But one of the big lessons one learns from an organization like ACT UP in the early days of HIV/AIDS is they discovered that if they wanted people in power to listen to them, and also the general public, they had to start speaking like scientists. And so that's why a lot of the ACT UP members, started reading science journals and really, kind of stunning. They started to stun FDA and NIH people with just how much they knew about clinical trials. I mean, it's kind of funny watching Fauci on TV, because at one point he was an antagonist of or a villain of ACT UP, at least in the early days, because they didn't think he was moving fast enough on this issue at NIH. And but later on, and there's a kind of famous book about these early days. And later on, he says, I was actually very impressed when HIV/AIDS activists came to the table and, could talk at this very highly elevated level. So, that highly elevated level sometimes, again, is used for bad, but and often used to exclude people. But this is a chance where it can, I think, actually be leveraged for good. And I tell my students to remember that you are in a position of privilege, a rarefied position. Not many people have those alphabets, and there is a chance where, simply by virtue of having, these fancy labels on you, people will listen to you.
Amen. Listen, I wonder if I might ask you something, and it'd be good for the rest of the panel to chime in. This is about self-care. Mm-hmm. Self-care at a moment when a lot of anxiety disorders are being created by the fact that all of us are shut in. I don't have any kids with me now, but there was a time when I had 4 children running around. I'm kind of glad that COVID-19 waited until now, because if I'd had to be locked up with those maniacs, for months at a time, I think I would have lost it. Because all of us are trying to maintain a certain professional focus. Many of us who are active in our professional lives feel helpless because basically it's the computer and us. Wondering if you have any advice for those of us who do service, for those of us who do research, for those of us who are engaged in any aspect of patient care. What might we do to take care of ourselves so that we aren't overwhelmed by all of the bad news and all the problems that just daily seem to become worse instead of better?
Yeah, that's a great point, Bob, and I think a very important issue. So I think people cope with stress and anxiety and crisis situations differently. And I think the key is to finding what works for you. I do think it is good for people to limit their exposure to the news and to social media, because if you're on that all day, it just becomes this endless cycle of negativity, and it increases the amount of hopelessness you feel and your anxiety and depression. So I know for me, I give myself certain times during the day when I can watch the news and read the news, and then after that I cut it off. for some people, exercise helps. For some people, taking time away helps. And in crowded New York City apartments, I know that can be difficult. Maybe you just need to lock yourself in the bathroom for a half hour or something and get a good book. For other people, cooking or baking, I know I've seen a lot of people do that. And I think it can be really hard, though, for people who have also had pre-existing, anxiety or depression conditions who are really triggered by this situation, and their conditions are further exacerbated. And sometimes all you can do really is think about just getting through the next hour or even the next 5 minutes. What's something I can do to get through the next 5 minutes? And don't think about the future and how long will this last? We don't know when this is going to end. What if this stretches on for months? I can't do that, because that becomes very disempowering and very overwhelming. So sometimes you just have to break things down into small, manageable chunks of time and just say, okay, I just need to get through the next hour, or I need to get through the next 5 minutes even, and then take it from there.
Excellent. Anyone else? Karma, since you spoke generally about these issues, what are you doing and how are you handling it?
Basically doing most of what Alyssa's saying. And I think I would just add to that, just really tapping into our social networks. I mean, as crazy as this Zoom thing may be for us, I know it's really helped me to keep connected to family and friends. And, we're playing like spades tournaments online. And so I think keeping that level of engagement, and also just being kind to yourself. I mean, really honoring and acknowledging that you may hit a wall at some point, and that's okay. Like, you may need to break down for a minute, and then, like Alyssa said, sort of partialize that and just experience those emotions, and then say, okay, now let me take a deep breath and let's see what I can sort of tackle one step at a time. So I think we also, particularly caregivers amongst us, whether that's within your home or just as a professional life, just reminding yourself that you need to also be kind to yourself, and that we're not perfect, we're human. And we also need to take the time to really do something that's outside of the news and just sort of fun, and take a walk when you can, play a game when you can, read a book when you can, sort of making that those small moments of time to really take care of ourselves.
Well done. Yeah, please.
Bob, can I add something to that? I just, Karma and others have done a wonderful job working with our students, many of whom are in deep distress over where we are. Everybody copes differently, and we've heard some great examples here of how to cope. One thing I'm really proud of at the school is that some of our faculty have come together under the leadership of Dr. Desmond Patton to come up with a list of volunteer opportunities that we have posted on our website for students, for faculty, for staff, for anybody really who wants to take a look. That's not right for everyone at this point in time. It depends on where you are mentally and how you're coping with this, and what the medical issues that you may be experiencing, or your family or your friends are experiencing. But for those who do want to feel an enhanced sense of agency and are ready to do that, we'd be, please take a look at our website at the Columbia School of Social Work. We've got a COVID-19 website that has a list of volunteer opportunities. A lot of telehealth, that sort of thing. But if that's of use to people, I hope they take a look at it.
Very good. I started to say that I am somebody who, in my head, I think I'm 19, but my birth certificate says I'm 76 years old. And as a consequence, I'm on everybody's call list. As an elder, I have hypertension, who's living with a condition that could be a real complication. I think it's clear that I'm African American, so I get phone calls on a regular basis and emails. Doc, how you doing? Are you okay? Do you need anything? Let me just, as an elder, tell you all that those things are very heartening. It does help, especially if, as is the case with a large swath of men in the United States who, like me, live by themselves. That kind of connection is one of the other ways in which we keep people alert. And I think it's one of the most effective ways of making sure that people don't fall ill. I just believe that there's something about one's expectations that if you do the right things, you can stay in good health. I think those are really important. And the connections that we feel with others that let us know that we're not simply by ourselves, I think those are things that folks might also consider. So all of you who are already engaged in calling parents, grandparents, and checking in on neighbors, that you know might be by themselves and who might be in distress, let me just say that those are also things that I think are helpful for our mental health, as well as for the mental health of the people that we contact. And then I'm also interested in asking the panel questions about what happens when this is all over, when the all clear will have sounded, and we're sort of back in the streets living something that looks like a return to normal life. I keep worrying that some of the incidents that we described earlier in this conversation about folks getting attacked, where your identity suddenly becomes a banner, where people saying it's your fault, you should be doing this. There is a lot of research about what happens in social settings when bystanders pay attention to what's going on. I think folk who are in social services are increasingly aware of the importance of acting in situations like this. And I'm wondering about what all of us might think about doing when, as bystanders on the subway, for example, we witness something that is a holdover from the nightmare of social isolation, a holdover of the nightmare of having lost so many family and friends to this virus. And where we're really clear that what we're witnessing is something that requires that somebody do something, that we not remain silent. Any notions about how we might think about doing that, not just as individuals, but maybe as part of what we teach in our courses and in our interactions with students?
I'll take a stab at it. I think it's important. I've thought a lot about these kinds of individual interactions, not just on the subway, but increasingly in the digital world, where you see somebody spout off on somebody's Facebook wall or Twitter or whatever. And I've always thought to myself, is it worth it to engage this toxic person in this one-on-one encounter, or not? These encounters, just to connect it to the self-care issue, often drain one if you're kind of arguing with this person over and over again, and that person just engaging you in bad faith. But I think it's useful to do that while remembering that ultimately it's not always these kinds of one-to-one stamp out the toxic thing on the subway or on social media that ends up contributing to long-term consequence. There has to be a larger collective component that we remember, that this is a collective endeavor, and that we can't stamp out these kinds of toxic ideas alone. There's two mantras that I kind of live by when it comes to social movement advocacy. And one is just very simple: you can't do it alone. There's a great tenant rights advocate in New York City named Sia Weaver, and she's been behind actually a lot of the tenant protections that have been passed in this state in the past couple of years. And I always have her come and speak to my class, and one of the things she says is you can't do this alone. And to get back to the self-care issue, a lot of advocates think that they have to do it alone. So sometimes if you see some kind of utterance on social media, it may be better to cut your losses and remember that it is ultimately a collective long term endeavor. And the other mantra is, an injury to one is an injury to all, right? This is the old kind of IWW slogan. If you kind of remember that, in some ways that takes you in the opposite direction. Just because you're a bystander and you're not being harmed by this, if you think about it in a collective way, I think you can think about it less as this kind of one-off interaction than contributing to a larger collective effort. But I think contextualizing those kinds of things as part of a collective, we're all in a struggle, is actually helps me think through, situate these individual encounters in some larger context.
Very good. I have a couple of questions now that have been coming in steadily since we began. I think I'm going to go to those if I might. From Elizabeth S., what types of policy changes need to be addressed that have implications for the populations in distress that we've been mentioning in the course of the seminar? This is engaging us in our role as researchers and as policy wonks. What are the policy changes that we would think of have to be confronted immediately, just in terms of all the things that we've been talking about with the responses to COVID-19? I think for one, I want to cite something from a professor in the School of Public Health, Larry Brown, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, once government gives a population, once it gives its citizens something, it's really hard to take it back. In my worry and in my work about what's happening with incarcerated populations, one of the absolutely remarkable things that I've observed is the number of ways in which the decision chain that ultimately makes someone a prisoner, ultimately has someone as an incarcerated individual, begins with the decision of the cop. Do I arrest this person or not? It begins with prosecutors. Do I charge this person? Do I have this person at a detention center? Should I make sure that this person pays a fine? If you're on parole, whether or not it's really necessary for there to be weekly visits where you see me in person. Because we've tried to help use policy changes to impact social distancing, the question now becomes, well, now that it's all over, do you want to go back to that? Have we not had way too many instances in which arrests were just something that put a lot of pressure on communities and on community members, but really didn't do that much to help us with the structural battles against crime or criminal behavior? I'm wondering whether or not policy changes in areas that have to do with ethnic minority populations, those that have to do with the folk who've been targeted by xenophobia, are there things in the policy world that should be addressed by the work that we do at the moment when we're confronting the end of the epidemic and thinking about what are we going to do to prevent its reoccurring in the future? Any notions?
Absolutely. I mean, I think policy, we have to look at policy across various sectors. So what's happening with housing and housing discrimination? I mean, there's a reason why, the lower income areas are, predominantly Black and Latinx. And we need to look at, lack of access to home loans or, Black people being forced out of home ownership just historically in the United States. I think we have to look at, like you said, policies around incarceration, the Rockefeller laws. I mean, what has led to these disproportionate representation of African Americans in our jails and prisons? And let's look at healthcare and, policies around funding, whether it's Medicaid or Medicare, what states are funding to what levels, who is getting access to that funding, where are medical facilities located in communities, private versus public. So I think when we talk about policy in sort of a very large amorphous sense, I think it's important for us to also just think about the various different sectors in which policy impacts everyone's lives, particularly lives of racially minoritized groups.
I too think, Bob, of a lot of research that's going on in social work in terms of poverty and economic mobility and also racism and health. And there are a lot of proposals that have been developed and from the Poverty Center, from the Cogburn Lab. These are things that we need to draw out now. And I'm wondering if this massive experiment that we're all living through presents us with a leverage point, right? So all of this has become so much more real to so many more people than ever before. I feel like we'd be remiss to not pursue this really hard right now and try to drive some changes through, protect the ACA for one. And ultimately, I'm just going to go to it and say it's about voting rights too, and electing the officials who will pursue the policies that will improve society and protect the most vulnerable, because that's what's missing right now.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, since it is an election year, one really hopes that this will be an opportunity for us to get more in the way of a policy discussion on the part of candidates. Too much of previous elections in the United States have been popularity contests that really measured how well do you come across on television. And as a person with a doctoral degree in education, I've been astounded at how in most presidential debates in the last couple of years, you never hear anybody talking about public schools. What should we do to improve the quality of public education? So one thinks that this is an opportunity when questions like that are going to be raised. And one wonders, and I'm again borrowing from a question asked by one of our participants, about the impact that COVID-19 is going to have on young people. They are clearly being traumatized by what's going on. The younger, the harder it is for parents to explain what's happening. And because we focused on bias, xenophobia, racism as part of the drivers for this, how do we help our children sort of understand what we know about one of the social implications of being caught up in a struggle like this? What are some of the things that we should be thinking about when we direct services, education, and interventions to the younger population so clearly impacted by this pandemic? Any notions? I'm going to ask that of everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a child psychologist, but I think you're right that it is very important that we provide support to young people during this time, because the impacts of this are not just now, but they will extend into the future. And it can be really difficult for parents who are dealing with their own emotions and challenges during this time to also be able to adequately support young people. But I think to the extent possible, the more they can provide structure and keep some sort of routine and help provide a semblance of calm during these tumultuous times can be very helpful. I think it's also important to look at the differential impacts that COVID-19 will have on young people of different racial and ethnic minority backgrounds and different socioeconomic populations, and think about the ways that we need to tailor interventions to best meet those diverse needs, because one program is not going to work for everyone. And so I think something that's really important for us as researchers and policymakers is to think about the most evidence-based ways that we can provide help, and what is the best way to implement these programs and roll them out so that we can mitigate and minimize the adverse outcomes of COVID-19 going forward.
Very good. Someone else has asked a question about the urban-rural divide. Almost all the mortality, almost all the stories, especially those that deal with the impact that this epidemic has had on minority populations, almost all of that has focused on what's going on in cities. And a lot of the, we need to get back to work, we need to get the economy back on its feet. One hears that a lot of that sentiment is in rural communities where they're just not seeing the epidemic in quite the way we are in a place like New York City. Any notions about the rural-urban divide? Is that something that we should be concerned about? Or for those of us who are in New York City, it's like, who goes to the country anyway? We don't have to worry about that. Any thoughts?
I mean, it is a chance, I think, to dispel what we think about when we hear these signifier terms, urban and rural. These are terms that are very much racialized, even though when you look at the actual demography of who lives in these places, it's a very heterogeneous demography. So that's I think one potential thing. You know, we might talk about. It seems like rural seems to often be a stand-in for white, but you know, if we care about racial disparities, that's a very kind of cavalier and very dangerous kind of stereotype of who lives in a rural community. So this might be a chance for us to actually really say that this divide is not a constructive way of thinking about population health. And
yeah, I think you're right that, because I've been saying a lot, that this is an opportunity for us to control and maybe even redo the narrative. That's one of the really important features. I have a question from Mark Laster. I was wondering if the panelists agree that social workers have not had a major presence on all medias regarding their stories during this pandemic. If you believe that that's true, why do you think that is so? I look for all the public types. So yeah, Alyssa, please.
Yeah, I do think that is unfortunately the case. I've seen far fewer media reports or news reports from social workers and their experiences during the COVID-19 epidemic. And it's unfortunate because I think they do have very important experiences to share. And these are also frontline workers. And I think partially a reason for this gap and lack of news reports from social workers just stems from a historical perspective where social work has traditionally been undervalued. And Fortunately, social workers, and we see that played out in a lot of ways, social workers are often not well paid for the very important work that they do, because society doesn't put as much value on that work.
That's all too true, that a lot of social workers are on the front lines and traditionally have not been getting the recognition that they deserve, because they're doing some of the hardest jobs in society.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to think consciously about ways to raise our voices, whether that's through, we were talking earlier about op-eds and blog posts, and within the school we were talking about a sort of StoryCorps website that we could generate where people could put down stories of COVID and their experience, both students, alums, as well as faculty and staff. I think we have to be much more intentional about amplifying our voices.
Very good. Jermaine H. asks, what would you recommend as strategies as a way to alleviate the stress of participants who are unable to access social service resources at this time? I want to point out that many of the questions that I'm seeing really are directed much more at the social work experience and at what social work professionals have been doing. I really do want to, for the time that's remaining, try and make sure that we deal with those questions, because I think those of us in public health are clear about what happens with healthcare services, but the social services issue, yes. I think there are a lot of people who are struggling to find their way, and it's hard for them to maintain contact. I'm just wondering whether the school or whether different agencies are doing things that are specifically directed at that population, folks who can't get services and who need them and are feeling anxious about them.
I think another complication here is the underfunding of these agencies, clearly. And what we found with a lot of our field placement partners is that some proportion of them have been able to move their services to an online environment so that they can still be called or emailed, and individuals can seek help that way. But that's a small proportion. It's by no means the majority. And so I think all of what we're experiencing, looking at all of you on Zoom right now, this is going to galvanize us to get up to speed on the technology, which I think has some barriers because of cost, but those costs are coming down. I think as we do needs assessment with agencies going forward and partner with them to make sure they can remain effective and engaged in outreach during crises like this, there has to be a lot more support for the remote type of engagement that we're doing right now.
Apropos that, Gina writes, can you speak to the mistrust in government that is present in so much of this versus the extreme paranoia that many people have? And how do we differentiate between the two? Mistrust in government, extreme paranoia, conspiracy theories, which I don't know about you, I hear about every single day. This is all in the area of misinformation and the problems that it creates when we're trying to send messages about what people have to do to keep themselves and their family members safe. Any notions about mistrust in government and how those of us in positions like ours are in a position to address that?
I think one starting point is to just ask the question, why do people mistrust? The easy answer is low information, dumb, etc. But that's too easy and often incredibly patronizing and condescending. This actually reminds me a lot of the earlier conversation we were having about our institution and how we relate to people at the neighborhood and community level. I think one thing that can be useful is to ask the larger question, why do people not just distrust in general, but why do they distrust professionals? And I think a dose of reflexivity actually goes a long way in changing the way people approach, changing how people like us, that is professionals, approach people on the ground and try to persuade them and get them to buy in to public health measures. It's useful to just listen to some of those conspiracy theories or misguided views and so forth, and then kind of just ask, in a community organizer fashion, well, why do you believe that? Why? Well, have you thought about this? No, I'm not disagreeing with you, but there is this. And, you know, you can kind of try to move people from maybe not A to Z, but maybe A to K, and then slowly, you know. So I think just a dose of humility rather than approaching it as why are these people so dumb to believe this kind of quackery. I mean, there's reasons why, I think. And it has a lot to do with how professionals have treated certain populations, I think, in the past. That's something very real we have to own up to.
Very true. We are 2 minutes away from ending this. We're very clear about time. I think 11:50, if I'm not mistaken, is when we said we're going to stop.
We can go a little beyond that to up to 12, Bob, if folks are willing. I have a question of my own, if I could throw in here, that I'd love to hear some perspective on. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I might have mentioned this to you before, but I read an excellent book recently by an historian named Kathleen Blue called Bring the War Home. It's about the rise of the white power movement, but in it she kind of carefully analyzes and dissects and documents how there have been surges of racism here in the US following wars, following armed conflicts. And she lays out a rationale for that. I can't do it justice in a few seconds, but I do recommend the book. It's really great. I think a lot of it, if I had to boil it down into a sentence, is it's how you define and view the enemy, right? And now I keep thinking of that as we talk about waging war on COVID, which is something I hear continually. And I'm just wondering, is that good language to use? How does that relate? Is there some interrelationship historically here? It just worries me. And I'm wondering if we should be using different terminology.
Yeah, let me just say that I'm one of the folk who immediately picked up the great influenza. The moment this happened, this is probably one of the best descriptions. I don't know John Barry, so this is not a plug, but it's far and away the best historical treatment of that period that one might imagine. I have a personal interest in this, as some of you know, because my grandmother died in 1918 as part of the Spanish flu epidemic, and my dad, who was born in 1910, was hugely influenced to become a physician. I know because of the death of his mom and the fact that his father, my grandfather, who was himself a physician, felt helpless to really do anything about what was going on. I keep thinking about that period as well, because part of what happened was that epidemic happened when we were at war. This is World War I. And the book points out that there was a huge amount of repression and censorship of the press. Letting people know that this pandemic was going was thought to be a way of reducing the country's morale at a point when it was at war, and it needed to be mobilized and united in a war-making effort. You didn't want to have voices of dissent saying, oh, by the way, we're in trouble because we've got this epidemic raging that no one seems to be able to control. Well, I worry about what happens when warfare and epidemic control get blended together. The lessons from 1918 seem to suggest that was not a good thing. It did not help, and a lot of mortality was literally occurred because we didn't do the job then of informing the public about the nature of the danger we were all facing. We are facing danger, and it's very clear, but mobilizing us as if we are at war, I think, is part of what feeds this xenophobic discourse that we've been hearing and fuels the racism, because if you start thinking that there's an enemy, and the enemy, for those of us who are human beings, is another person, then anyone who looks Asian, anyone who's a member of a poor, disadvantaged community of color, suddenly becomes part of the problem instead of someone with whom I'm uniting to create something that looks like a solution. So yeah, I worry about warfare. I worry about organizing our thinking around that particular image. And I think it really, in the end, does us much more of a disservice than anything else. That at least is how I take this. Any other thoughts on this?
Completely agree, Bob. I mean, I think the minute we first heard about sort of the war on the virus, I immediately thought war on drugs, war on poverty, and how those were immediately racialized in this country, right? And so that's what's happening now. It's like there is the literal connection to war with respect to sort of a militarized notion and censorship, et cetera, but also just this idea that we're using that term to really speak to and feed, as you just said, Bob, the the racism and the xenophobia, whether it's the anti-Asian racism, whether it's the anti-Black racism, anti-Latinx. I mean, so language does matter, and I bristle when I hear people refer to it as a war on this disease.
Well said. Well said.
I think the onus on us is to come up with an alternative framing. I totally agree. I haven't quite figured out what that alternative framing is, though, but yes, the war one is very disturbing in many ways.
Yeah. So go ahead, Alyssa. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say I agree. I think anytime we use the term war, it just becomes a justification for discriminatory policies or violation of rights.
Yeah. So we've got about 5 minutes, I would say, left. Bob, how would you like to proceed?
I would like to ask if our panelists have anything that I haven't touched upon that you think it's important for us to mention. This is your opportunity for your last word on all this. So I'm going by the way my screen is organized. And Dean Bett, I'm going to end with you because I think that's how it should be. Alyssa, any thoughts, anything that we needed to be thinking about or talking about that might be mentioned at this juncture?
Not anything to add other than what was already said. I think just make sure to practice self-care and take care of yourself during this time. And if you do see issues of racism or discrimination, do speak out against that and be an advocate for that.
Merlin, you're the next on my screen.
I would say, we're seeing all these social developments of at least the past 40 or 50 years coming to a head with this one particular crisis. And one thing I often see with public health students, and I suspect it's similar in social work, is that sometimes they view what we do as a purely technical enterprise. But I think this is all showing that this is also, it is a technical enterprise and we want technical excellence, but this is also a political enterprise too. I mean, we are seeing very clearly how much politics and who holds power changes how this plays out and who gets impacted and who doesn't as much. And so I hope down the line we can incorporate kind of a political analysis into our work as well, while still holding on to the importance of technical expertise.
Rama?
I think I just want to reiterate what everyone said and sort of riffing off of what Merlin started with around the historical context of never forgetting, that I think that as we progress through this pandemic and sort of move back to our old normal, that we don't forget sort of the racialized nature of this entire situation, and that we also don't forget that we can't do this alone. I mean, this is a time for community building, for coalition building across disciplines, across professions, across this idea of formal versus informal networks, and who has the letters behind their name versus not, and building those bridges. So I would just encourage folks to continue on that path, never forget, continue the coalition building, continue the self-care, and also continue the heightened self-awareness.
My colleague and ex-wife, Mindy Fullilove, has often written in the course of COVID-19 that this is a moment when we shouldn't descend into identity politics and need to be really thinking about collaborations and coalitions. Much of what I worry about as this becomes a much more Black epidemic is that there'll be a kind of a retreat into the community where we're so intense on drawing the wagons around us. We don't seize opportunities to link to other groups that are similarly being impacted by racism, by xenophobia, and who are essentially facing the same kinds of challenges that we're facing. Coalition building has never been easy in our field because so much of what we do is compete for resources with each other. There isn't enough to go around, so frequently your take on racism means that you're going to have a Dominican group vying with a Puerto Rican group that's vying with a Black group in order to get the same kind of work done. I imagine there are going to be all kinds of resources for rebuilding. I imagine that the whole question of how those resources are used could easily fall into the trap of identity politics, where we shore up our own communities but don't understand how we're all connected in this crisis together. coalition building, she has said, is the wave of the future. And I really think that's something that should be echoed in our work, in our thinking, and in our classrooms. We are in this together. What can we do as educators and as researchers to make sure that our students, our colleagues, and the folk that we work with feel that and are engaged in it as well? Dean Begg, last word is on you.
Thank you, Bob. And let me start by saying thank you to a fantastic panel. I know you can't hear applause, but I know there's a lot of people logged in who've really benefited from hearing from this, and we're grateful for their participation and supplying some questions for a really great conversation. I think that we've had a very wide-ranging and important discussion, and it's clear we're up against a host of obstacles and threats in many ways everywhere we look. We've uncovered and dissected some of those as part of this conversation. But rather than using that as a reason to sort of descend into hopelessness, I think it presses us to ask the question, what are we going to do about it? That's why a lot of people joined us today, is to talk about what are we going to do about it. And Merlin, you touched on it a moment ago. You know, these academics, they do sort of technical stuff, they do theoretical stuff, but here at Columbia, especially in social work, we've always been guided by a commitment to social justice. And I think it's true in social work and it's true in public health that though we are academics, we have a profound commitment to practicality, and we take pride in that practicality, trying to do things that make a difference in the world. And I think all of the remarks that you've made today support that notion, and it's a really important one. We take pride in that practice. Talking about the epidemic, talking about racism reminds me that I'm really proud of the curriculum that my colleagues in social work have developed around PROP, around power, race, oppression, and privilege. It's a core course because understanding those dynamics is essential to effective practice and to wreaking the change we want to see. I don't claim that our school has all of the answers on that front. This is a long game. But I can say without hesitation that we are fully committed to engaging in difficult conversations like the ones we've had today, and supporting long-term processes and solutions that will ensure equity and inclusivity and keep those at the center of our focus going forward. Among us today, both on the panel and people listening in, I think are passionate advocates for social justice and human dignity. And I think we have to use this as our galvanizing moment. Many of you have heard me say this before, but so much of human suffering is manufactured by policy, by lack of policy, and we need better policy. And this is a moment that we can seize to re-envision the future and leverage what so many people are experiencing collectively in the same moments almost to make the change that we want to see. The obstacles are enormous, but so is our will. And change has to begin with us. So again, grateful to all of you for participating today. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. An honor to be here.